It was a sweltering afternoon in rural Florida on May 12, 2007. The sun hung high, scorching the rooftops of the modest suburban homes dotting the landscape. In front of the Robertson residence, an ominous silence settled that would soon be shattered by sirens and flashing lights. Inside, the scene was something no neighbor could have anticipated. Sheriff Daniel Dan Robertson stood motionless in the living room, a 9M service pistol dangling loosely from his right hand. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stared down at his wife, Jessica Robertson, lying still on the hardwood floor. A single gunshot wound marred her chest. Blood pooled beneath her, darkening the oak planks. Outside, the humid Florida air pressed in, but inside, it felt ice cold. For what felt like an eternity, Dan couldn't move, couldn't think. He was aware of the silence, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall and the deafening throb of his own heartbeat. The living room, once the center of family gatherings, children's laughter, and holiday decorations, now felt like the grim stage of a final, violent act. Outside the window, a neighbor's dog barked, a small but jarring reminder of the normal life that carried on just beyond these walls. Dan's 5 children were nowhere to be seen. They had left for a weekend trip with a friend. Thank God for that, he thought fleetingly. The idea of his children witnessing this carnage made him shudder. He crouched down, his knees crackling in protest. He reached out with trembling fingers to feel Jessica's pulse, hoping for a miracle, but there was none. Her skin was cooling rapidly. He pressed his eyes shut, recalling the moments that led him here. The anger, the betrayal, the horrifying revelation about the real father of his 5 kids. DNA results had confirmed the unspeakable, that his own father had fathered them. A wave of fresh rage rippled through him. Footsteps outside snapped him back to the present. He heard frantic knocking on the front door. Someone must have heard the gunshot. His radio crackled to life, a deputy's voice bleating out a call for him. But how could he explain any of this? When the door burst open, Deputy Marla Jenkins stood on the threshold. She froze at the sight of her boss, cradling his dead wife. Her lips parted in horror. "Sheriff?" she stammered, not knowing whether to draw her weapon or rush to help. "What happened?" Dan stared at her, his mind swirling with too many thoughts for coherent speech. He attempted to formulate words, but everything stuck in his throat like glue. All he could manage was a ragged whisper. "She's dead." Outside, sirens grew louder as more patrol cars converged on the house. Dan closed his eyes, letting the red and blue lights dance across his eyelids. How could he explain that he'd pulled the trigger in a moment of blind rage, fueled by a betrayal so deep it threatened his very sense of self? Deputy Jenkins hurried to Jessica's side, feeling for a pulse as another deputy rushed in, pistol drawn. Upon seeing the sheriff's sidearm on the floor and the blood-spattered uniform, confusion and dread filled the small living room. In the distance, neighbors gathered, whispering in hushed tones. They recognized Dan's cruiser and the uniform, yet they couldn't fathom why the sheriff himself would be involved in something so grim. Within minutes, the house buzzed with responding officers and paramedics. Yellow tape would soon cordon off the perimeter. Cameras would flash, capturing every inch of the once cozy home. For Dan, the nightmare was just beginning. The question wasn't just who pulled the trigger, but why? And the answer lay in a DNA test that had fractured his world beyond repair. The beginning of Sheriff Dan Robertson's suspicions traced back to a seemingly harmless conversation 6 months prior. He and Jessica were hosting a backyard barbecue for Dan's 63-year-old father, Roy, who had driven in from Jacksonville for a weekend visit. Roy was one of those men whose presence commanded attention, despite his quiet disposition. Something about his unwavering gaze always seemed to pierce through a person's outer facade. As the burgers sizzled on the grill and neighbors chatted over cold beers, a friend of the family casually noted how Jessica and Roy shared a rather remarkable resemblance, particularly around the eyes and jawline. At first, Dan laughed it off. After all, Roy was his father, and Jessica was his wife. Family resemblances were bound to happen in certain photos or gestures, right? But the seed of curiosity was planted. That night, after the party, Dan found himself tossing and turning in bed. Something about that remark gnawed at him. He tried to recall all the times he had looked at his children, 3 boys and 2 girls, and had noticed odd little quirks. Their hair color was more like Roy's than his own. Their mannerisms sometimes mirrored Roy's calm, deliberate way of speaking. He tried to bury the thought, attributing it to simple genetics or coincidence. But the notion festered. Jessica, always an attentive mother and devoted wife, noticed Dan's restlessness in the following weeks. She asked him if something was wrong, but he brushed it off as job stress. He was a sheriff, after all. It wasn't unusual for him to lose sleep over petty crime spikes or departmental issues. Yet each time Dan hugged one of his children, an unsettling question flickered in his mind. What if they aren't mine? His suspicions remained just that, vague, shapeless worries, until he stumbled upon a letter addressed to Jessica from an anonymous sender. He found it in the mailbox one morning, and curiosity got the best of him. The short, typed note read, "You don't deserve him. The truth will come out." The letter offered no direct threats, but it was chilling enough to raise Dan's hackles. Jessica's reaction was even more telling. She turned pale, then hastily tried to dismiss it as a prank or a mistake, but Dan knew her better than anyone. He saw the flash of fear in her eyes. Compelled to investigate, Dan asked a friend at a local laboratory to run a discreet paternity test for his oldest son. He used some of his own hair samples along with his son's leftover toothbrush. He told no one, not even Jessica. The wait for the result was agonizing. Each day felt like a slow crawl through quicksand. Each time his phone vibrated, his stomach churned at the possibility of receiving the lab's call. When the results finally came, Dan's entire world tilted on its axis. The test concluded with 99.9% certainty that Dan was not his oldest son's biological father. His knees nearly buckled. Over the next few weeks, he covertly tested each of the other 4 kids, desperate for an alternative explanation, but the results repeated the same dreadful conclusion. 5 children, each not his. The question of who was their father became a haunting echo. Jessica had never shown any signs of infidelity with anyone, at least not that Dan noticed. Then, a terrifying thought crystallized. He remembered the remark about how his wife and father looked alike, the letter's cryptic message, and Roy's odd lingering gazes at Jessica. Darkness closed in as he realized that his father, Roy, might be the culprit. During the final nights before his confrontation, Dan barely slept. The next time Roy visited would be the moment Dan demanded an answer. The seeds of suspicion had grown into a cancerous dread, and Dan knew that once he pulled at this tangled thread, there might be no turning back. Jessica's sobs filled the kitchen on the fateful morning Dan chose to confront her about the DNA results. It was 2 months before May 12, 2007, and Dan couldn't keep the secret any longer. He had given her one last chance to come clean on her own, but she kept insisting there was nothing to confess. Cornered, he slammed the lab reports onto the wooden dining table, the pages fanning out like damning evidence at a trial. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "Ha, 5 kids. Not mine. All these years. Why, Jessica? Dun, dun." She struggled to speak, tears streaking her cheeks. The guilt in her eyes was unmistakable, and Dan felt his blood run cold. "I don't know what you want me to say," she stammered. "I never wanted to hurt you." He had anticipated her tears, but not the way they would affect him. Instead of compassion, all he felt was betrayal. "Who's their father?" he whispered, though he already suspected the answer. She swallowed hard, unable to meet his gaze. When she finally uttered Roy's name, Dan's world collapsed. The air seemed to leave the room in a whoosh, leaving him gasping. He seized the edge of the table, his knuckles white. This confession was even more horrifying out loud than it had been in his thoughts. "How did this happen?" he demanded. "Tell me everything." Jessica's story tumbled out in fragments. It had started a decade ago, shortly before Dan and Jessica were married. Roy, charismatic and surprisingly persuasive, had preyed on Jessica's doubts and loneliness when Dan was off at the police academy. One indiscretion led to another, culminating in a secret affair that continued sporadically over the years. The children, each born under the pretense of being Dan's, were in fact fathered by Roy. Jessica claimed fear of losing Dan and a fear of Roy's control kept her silent all this time. Dan sank into a chair, the room spinning around him. His father had twisted everything, betraying both his son and the sanctity of the family. Jessica, now racked with shame, dropped to her knees, begging for forgiveness. Anger, heartbreak, and disbelief warred inside Dan. He wanted to cast her out, to rage at her for her deception. But he also couldn't ignore how she painted Roy as a manipulative figure who had a hold on her. Unable to stay in that house, Dan fled. He drove aimlessly for hours, scorching Florida heat beating down on his cruiser, but it was nothing compared to the fury inside him. He replayed every loving memory with Jessica, every family picnic, every holiday, and felt them corrode under the weight of this secret. The children he had cherished, taught, and protected were not his by blood. Worse still, they were a product of incestuous betrayal. His own father with his own wife. In the days that followed, Dan reached out to Roy but got no response. Roy's phone went straight to voicemail and texts remained unanswered. Dan's mind churned with scenarios. Maybe Roy had fled. Maybe he was lurking, waiting for his chance to twist a knife further. Each unanswered call stoked Dan's fury and fear. When Roy finally agreed to meet him 2 nights before May 12th, Dan felt a grim, determined calm settle in. This confrontation would either end with some semblance of truth or it would end in violence. Jessica tried to stop him from going, tears streaming down her face. She insisted it was a mistake, that Roy would harm them both if they pushed too hard. But Dan was a lawman, trained to confront evil and injustice. He refused to be manipulated any longer. He needed answers. That meeting would set the stage for the tragic finale. The once respected sheriff would soon stand at the center of a crime scene, haunted by the revelations that had turned love into rage and a family into a nightmare. 2 nights before the fatal shooting, Dan drove out to Roy's rundown lake house at the edge of town. Tucked away among towering cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, it was an isolated spot, a fitting backdrop for a meeting layered with ominous tension. The house itself was an aging structure, its wooden planks warped by years of humidity and neglect. Roy awaited him on the rickety porch, leaning against a rusted metal railing. A half-empty whiskey bottle sat at his feet. At first glance, he looked oddly composed, his silver hair combed back neatly. But there was a flicker in his eyes, an unsettling mix of triumph and mild apprehension. Dan had barely got out of his cruiser before the accusations poured from his lips. "You destroyed my family," he snarled, marching up the steps. "You slept with my wife, fathered my children, lied to me for years." Roy's expression flickered briefly, as though considering whether to deny it. He settled on a silent nod, confirming Dan's worst fears. "What do you want me to say, hon?" he said eventually. His voice was low, even somewhat bored, which only spiked Dan's fury. "It happened. Jessica came to me. She was lonely. You were gone. We didn't plan on it lasting this long." That casual tone was too much. Dan lunged, shoving Roy against the porch railing. The rusted metal groaned, threatening to give way. "She was lonely because I was training to protect people. My family!" Dan's voice echoed off the still waters of the lake. His heart hammered so loudly he feared it might burst. Roy simply shrugged, lips curling into a hint of a smirk. "Look at you," Roy taunted softly, his hand gripping Dan's shoulder in an iron hold. "Big bad sheriff, so sure of himself, and yet you couldn't even keep your own wife faithful. Maybe you weren't man enough for her." Dan's world went red. He punched Roy across the jaw, sending the older man sprawling. Roy spat blood onto the wooden boards, then laughed. "You want me out of your life, Dan? Fine. But we both know the real reason you're furious is because you can't stand the truth. I'm the father of your kids. They'll always be mine, no matter what you do." For a moment, Dan considered pulling out his service weapon right then, ending it all on that creaking porch. But the oath he took as a lawman stayed his hand. He roared in frustration, storming back to his cruiser as Roy's mocking laughter trailed behind him. The next 48 hours were a fog of resentment, confusion, and heartbreak. Back home, Jessica begged Dan to leave Roy alone, swearing that she had broken it off with him years ago and only kept the secret out of fear. Tensions flared every time Jessica tried to apologize. Dan couldn't even look at her without seeing Roy's smirk. He found himself pacing through the house, staring at the children's photos with new eyes. Haunted eyes. On May 12, 2007, the morning started like any other. Coffee brewing, the kids gathering their overnight bags to head to a friend's place, but the tension clung to the air like storm clouds. After the children left, Dan confronted Jessica for what felt like the 100th time. She tried to calm him, telling him that they could somehow move forward, maybe therapy, maybe divorce, but something that didn't involve. And then she uttered Roy's name once more in a plea for Dan to reconcile. Something in Dan's mind snapped. The gun was in his hand before he even realized it. A lifetime of discipline disintegrated in an instant of primal blind rage. He squeezed the trigger, a single shot that echoed through every corner of his life. Jessica collapsed, her eyes wide with shock. As Dan knelt in horror over her body, the reality crashed down. The man who had spent his career enforcing the law had just become the worst kind of criminal. The taboo secret, the betrayal, the unstoppable chain of events, they converged into one final deadly moment. Dan knew there was no going back. When Deputy Marla Jenkins and the other officers arrived at the Robertson home, they found their sheriff unresponsive and drenched in guilt, kneeling beside Jessica's body. At first, confusion reigned. Dan was their boss, the man who had kept law and order in their small Florida county. How could he be involved in such a horrific crime? Paramedics rushed in, but it was too late for Jessica. She was pronounced dead on the scene. Dan, meanwhile, stood up with his hands raised, tears streaming down his face. He made no attempt to flee or deny responsibility. "I did this," he confessed in a hollow voice. He couldn't summon the will to say more. As the afternoon wore on, investigators cordoned off the property. CSI technicians photographed the living room, the bullet casing on the floor, the splatters of blood. Each detail was meticulously recorded. Dan was placed in the back of a squad car, his own department, ironically enough. The driver was Deputy Jenkins, who kept shooting him wounded glances in the rearview mirror. She'd known him for years, admired him. Now she drove him to the station to be booked and questioned like any other suspect. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community. By evening, news trucks blocked the street, their cameras aimed at the Robertson home. Rumors swirled. Had Jessica been cheating? Was Dan covering up something? No one guessed the horrifying truth that Roy, Dan's own father, was the biological father of Dan's 5 children. Dan sat in an interrogation room, silent and motionless, his head bowed. Chief Deputy Ellis, an older man who had mentored Dan, stepped in to talk. As Ellis gently probed for a reason behind the crime, Dan broke down, tears soaking the collar of his uniform. Slowly, through choked sobs, he confessed the full story. The affair, the paternity tests, the confrontation. In the days that followed, a tidal wave of evidence came to light. Jessica's diaries and letters hinted at long-standing manipulation by Roy. DNA tests confirmed that Roy was indeed the biological father to all 5 children. Roy himself, when questioned, showed no remorse, insisting that everything had been consensual. Morally wrong or not, it was a matter of the heart, he said. The town reeled from the revelations, newspapers splashing lurid headlines across their front pages. Sheriffs fathered by grandfather. Mother dead at son's hand. Dan was suspended from duty immediately and taken to a facility in a neighboring county to avoid conflict of interest. No one could ignore the grim irony of a sheriff sitting behind bars, awaiting trial for murder. His children, still reeling from the news that their biological grandfather was also their father, were placed under the care of a maternal aunt out of state. They struggled to grasp the shocking truth, their young minds unable to process the swirling chaos that had become their lives. Eventually, Dan stood before a judge. The press swarmed the courthouse, cameras flashing as he was led inside in handcuffs. In a short statement, Dan pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He offered no defense, no desire to fight the charges. He believed he deserved punishment for taking Jessica's life, no matter the twisted circumstances that led him to that breaking point. Inside that grim courtroom, the townspeople watched their once respected lawman crumble. The prosecuting attorney laid out the horrific chain of events, weaving in the DNA results as the motive for the crime. One journalist described it as the most grotesque family betrayal this county has ever witnessed. When the judge handed down the sentence, 25 years in a maximum security prison, Dan merely nodded. He showed no visible reaction, as if the worst punishment had already been inflicted the moment he realized the truth about his children. Roy, meanwhile, faced legal repercussions for various charges, but the main shock of the scandal overshadowed his trial. The family was shattered beyond repair. In the aftermath, the Florida town where Dan once served as a beloved sheriff was left to pick up the pieces. Whispered rumors became the stuff of local legend, and the Robertson home, marked by yellow tape and tragedy, stood empty. Residents would pass by, shaking their heads at the memory of how one secret transformed a seemingly normal household into a nightmare worthy of the darkest television crime show. The final tragedy was that 5 innocent children carried the burden of their grandfather's betrayal, their mother's death, and their father's crime. Dan would live the rest of his days knowing that he had been complicit in ending a life, even if that life had betrayed him. And every time the Florida sun set behind the cypress trees, the town remembered May 12, 2007 as the day the law turned on itself and the darkest secrets of the Robertson family came to light in a single gunshot.